The air inside Studio A carried that particular weight of expensive anticipation, the kind that settles over a recording session when everyone knows they're working on something that could either become legendary or spectacularly fail. Whitney Houston stood in the hallway outside the control room, her back pressed against the cool concrete wall, trying to steady her breathing. Through the thick studio door, she could hear voices, animated and confident, discussing arrangements and orchestration for a song that would become forever intertwined with her legacy. But at that moment, she had no idea that the next hour would challenge everything she believed about herself as a vocalist. The Bodyguard project had been following Whitney for years, long before she agreed to star in it. The screenplay, written by Lawrence Kasdan back in 1975, had originally been intended for Steve McQueen and Diana Ross. 17 years later, after countless rewrites and failed attempts to get the film made, the project had finally found its stars. Kevin Costner, riding high on the success of Dances with Wolves and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, had attached himself as both producer and leading man. And he wanted only one person to play Rachel Marin, the superstar singer being stalked by an obsessive fan. Whitney Houston. For Whitney, the decision to accept the role had been agonizing. She was the biggest name in music, with 7 consecutive #1 singles and album sales that had redefined success in the recording industry. But acting was completely new territory. Every interview, every conversation about the film was dominated by one question from reporters, critics, and industry insiders alike. Can she actually act? The pressure was immense. Warner Brothers had invested $50 million, a massive budget for 1992, betting that Whitney's global popularity would translate to box office success. If she failed, it wouldn't just be embarrassing. It would be a very public, very expensive disaster that could permanently damage her crossover credibility. Kevin Costner had been unwavering in his belief in Whitney from the beginning. He had fought studio executives who wanted established actresses, resisted pressure to cast someone with proven dramatic experience, and put his own reputation on the line by insisting that Whitney was perfect for the role. But that confidence extended beyond her acting ability. Kevin understood something that went deeper than just whether Whitney could deliver lines convincingly. He understood that her voice, that instrument that had sold over 60 million albums, was the real heart of the film. The music wasn't just going to be a soundtrack. It was going to be an essential part of the storytelling itself. The song selection process for the film had been intense and carefully considered. They needed songs that would work both as standalone hits and as emotional beats within the film's narrative structure. David Foster, the legendary producer who had worked with everyone from Barbra Streisand to Michael Jackson, had been brought in to oversee the musical side of the production. Foster's track record was impeccable. He had an almost supernatural ability to craft songs that became cultural touchstones, and his involvement in the project gave everyone confidence that the music would be extraordinary. One song had emerged as the centerpiece, the emotional climax that would define both the film and its soundtrack. I Will Always Love You, originally written and recorded by Dolly Parton in 1974, was a gentle country ballad that had become a standard. Dolly's version was beautiful, intimate, and restrained, staying true to the simple honesty of country music storytelling. But David Foster had a vision for transforming it into something massive, a power ballad that would showcase every ounce of Whitney's vocal range and technical ability. He had created an arrangement that was pure 1990s epic production, complete with a full orchestral opening, dramatic key changes, and a climactic final chorus that would push Whitney into her highest register. The arrangement Foster had created was technically brilliant. It followed every rule of what made pop songs successful in the early 90s. Big production, dramatic builds, layers of instrumentation that created emotional crescendo. Radio programmers loved songs that grabbed listeners in the first 3 seconds, and Foster's orchestral opening was designed to do exactly that. Sweeping strings would announce immediately that this was an important cinematic song. Everything about the arrangement screamed prestige, drama, and commercial appeal. But Kevin Costner had a completely different idea. It was a Thursday afternoon when Kevin walked into the studio where Whitney and David Foster were doing preliminary work on the vocal arrangements. The track was queued up and ready to play, and Foster was excited to demonstrate what he had created. The energy in the room was positive, collaborative, with everyone focused on making something extraordinary. Kevin listened to the full arrangement once through, standing in the back of the control room with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When the song finished, there was a moment of silence as everyone waited for his reaction. What Kevin said next made everyone in that studio think he had completely lost his mind. "Stop everything," Kevin said quietly but with unmistakable authority. "We need to change the opening." David Foster turned around in his chair, his expression curious but slightly defensive. Foster had spent weeks crafting this arrangement, consulting with the best musicians and engineers in Lowe's Angels. Every element had been carefully considered and balanced. "What do you mean?" Foster asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. Kevin walked to the center of the control room, positioning himself so he could see both Foster and Whitney, who had just entered from the recording booth. "The orchestral opening," Kevin said, meeting Foster's eyes directly. "It's beautiful, it's technically perfect, but it's wrong." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Foster's longtime engineer exchanged glances with the assistant producer. Nobody challenged David Foster on musical arrangements. The man was a genius with 19 Grammy nominations and unmatched instincts for what worked in popular music. Whitney shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension, but not yet understanding what Kevin was proposing. "I want Whitney to sing the first verse completely alone," Kevin continued, his voice calm but absolutely certain. "No instruments, no strings, no piano, nothing, just her voice." The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. Foster stared at Kevin for what felt like a full minute before responding. "Kevin," he said, carefully choosing his words, "that's not how pop radio works. Program directors need an instrumental hook in the first 5 seconds. If we start a cappella, stations will turn it off before Whitney even gets to the first chorus. It's commercial suicide." Kevin didn't back down. "Her voice is the hook," he said simply. "We don't need to tell listeners this is an important song with a big orchestral opening. Whitney's voice will tell them everything they need to know." Foster shook his head, frustration beginning to show in his body language. "You're talking about breaking every rule of radio formatting. Pop stations in 1992 do not play songs that start with unaccompanied vocals. Adult contemporary won't touch it. We're talking about millions of dollars in potential sales. And you want to start with an approach that guarantees radio resistance." The debate continued for another 20 minutes, with Foster bringing up example after example of recent hits that had succeeded specifically because of their instrumental openings. He cited chart data, radio research, and his own decades of experience. Every argument was logical, backed by evidence, and rooted in genuine concern for the song's commercial success. And Kevin listened to all of it respectfully before repeating the same thing he had said at the beginning. "Her voice is the hook." Whitney had remained quiet during the entire exchange, standing near the doorway and watching two men she deeply respected argue about the best way to present her voice to the world. Part of her was flattered that they cared so passionately about getting it right. But another part of her, the part that had been fighting insecurity since accepting this acting role, was terrified by what Kevin was proposing. An orchestral opening meant there would be something grand and cinematic to grab the listener's attention before her voice entered. It provided context, emotional setup, and a safety net of sorts. If the song didn't work, she could tell herself that maybe the arrangement was wrong or the production choices were off target. But if she started a cappella, completely exposed with nothing to hide behind, there would be no question about what succeeded or failed. It would be entirely on her voice, her interpretation, her vulnerability. "What do you think, Whitney?" Kevin asked, turning to look directly at her. Everyone in the control room shifted their attention to her, waiting for her response. She felt her throat tighten, that familiar sensation of pressure that had been her constant companion since the film started shooting. "I don't know," she said honestly, her voice quieter than she intended. "What if I mess up? What if my pitch isn't perfect on that first note? With an orchestra, there's some room for adjustment, for blending. But if I'm completely alone?" She trailed off, not wanting to articulate the fear that was really driving her hesitation. The fear that maybe she wasn't good enough. That maybe all her success had been due to great production and talented collaborators, and when stripped down to just her voice, she would be revealed as somehow insufficient. Kevin walked over to where Whitney was standing and spoke directly to her, his voice low enough that the others had to strain to hear. "Do you trust me?" he asked. Whitney met his eyes and nodded slowly. Since the beginning of this project, Kevin had been her biggest advocate, her protector, her believer. When she doubted herself on set, when she felt like she was drowning in the technical aspects of acting, Kevin had been the one who pulled her aside and reminded her why she was chosen. Not because she could act like someone else, but because she was Whitney Houston, and that was more than enough. "Then trust me now," Kevin said. "Your voice doesn't need anything behind it. It doesn't need strings to make it important or drums to make it powerful. When you sing that first line, 'I will always love you,' it needs to be just you. Raw, honest, vulnerable. That's what will make people stop everything they're doing and listen." Whitney felt tears starting to form and blinked them back quickly. She wasn't sure if it was fear, gratitude, or the overwhelming weight of expectation. Probably all three. "Okay," she said softly. "If you really think that's right, then okay, I'll try it." David Foster had been watching this exchange from across the room, and now he leaned back in his chair with a long exhale. He wasn't happy about the decision, that much was clear. But he was also professional enough to recognize when a producer, especially one who was also the film's star and had final creative control, had made up his mind. "Fine," Foster said, though his tone suggested it was anything but fine. "We'll record it both ways, with the orchestral opening and a cappella. Then we can test them and see which one actually works on radio." Kevin nodded, accepting the compromise. "That's fair, but I want to record the a cappella version first." What happened in the recording booth over the next 3 hours became part of music industry legend, though the full story was never widely known outside the people who were actually present that day. Whitney stood alone in the isolation booth, the large microphone positioned precisely at mouth level, her headphones resting around her neck, because she didn't need to hear anything except her own voice finding the right pitch, the right emotion, the right vulnerability that Kevin believed would make the song transcendent. The first take was technically perfect. Whitney's pitch was flawless, her tone pure and controlled. But when David Foster played it back through the studio monitors, everyone in the control room knew something was missing. It was beautiful but safe. Whitney was singing with the professionalism and precision of someone who had spent years training to be technically excellent, but without the emotional rawness that would make someone stop in their tracks and truly feel the song. "Let's try it again," Foster said into the talkback microphone. "Maybe a little more emotion this time." Whitney nodded and reset herself, taking a deep breath before launching into the opening line again. This take had more feeling, more connection to the lyrics, but it still wasn't quite right. There was a guardedness to it, as if Whitney was protecting herself from being too exposed. After the 5th take, Kevin asked Foster to cut the talkback microphone so Whitney couldn't hear what they were discussing in the control room. "She's holding back," Kevin said quietly to Foster and the engineer. "She's technically perfect, but she's not letting us see what's really inside. She's afraid." Foster nodded slowly, his earlier frustration giving way to genuine concern for Whitney's emotional state. "Maybe the a cappella opening is too much pressure," he suggested. "We can always come back to it after we record the full version with instruments. Let her feel confident with the safety net first." But Kevin shook his head. "No, we need to do this now. If she records the safe version first, she'll convince herself that's good enough. We need her to be brave right now, even though it's terrifying." Kevin stood up and walked into the recording booth himself, something that surprised everyone watching. Producers and actors rarely entered the technical space during recording sessions. But Kevin sat down on the floor of the booth right in front of Whitney, close enough that they could have a conversation without the microphones picking it up clearly. Nobody knows exactly what Kevin said to Whitney during those 8 minutes they spent alone in that recording booth. The people in the control room could see them talking, could see Whitney wiping tears from her eyes, could see Kevin holding both of her hands and speaking with an intensity and gentleness that made it clear this was about much more than just getting the right vocal take. When Kevin finally stood up and left the booth, Whitney's entire posture had changed. The tension in her shoulders had softened. The fear in her eyes had transformed into something that looked almost like acceptance, or perhaps surrender. Kevin walked back into the control room, pressed the talkback button, and said simply, "Whenever you're ready." Whitney closed her eyes, took one long breath that seemed to draw strength from some deep place within her, and then opened her mouth to sing. What came out in that next take was something that nobody in that studio had ever heard before, even from Whitney Houston, whose voice had already redefined what was possible in popular music. "If I should stay, I would only be in your way." The words came out with a vulnerability that was almost painful to hear. This wasn't Whitney the superstar. This wasn't the voice that had conquered the Billboard charts and sold out arena tour worldwide. This was a woman who understood loss, who had felt the specific heartbreak of loving someone enough to let them go. The note on the word, way, bent slightly, not in a showy, melismatic run, but in a way that sounded like her voice was almost breaking from emotion. Every person in the control room felt the hair on their arms stand up. Whitney continued through the first verse completely alone, her voice filling the space with an intimacy that made listeners feel like they were intruding on a private moment. There was no protection, no safety net of instrumentation to catch her if she faltered. Just pure vocal expression, technically brilliant but also emotionally devastating. When she reached the end of the first verse, and the instrumentation was scheduled to enter, David Foster had his hand poised over the console to bring in the orchestra. But something made him hesitate. For several seconds that felt much longer, Whitney's voice hung in the air completely unaccompanied as she transitioned into the chorus. And then, exactly when it felt right, when the emotional buildup had reached the point where it needed that surge of sonic support, the full arrangement came crashing in. The contrast was staggering. Going from the naked vulnerability of Whitney's lone voice to the full orchestral power was like going from an intimate whisper to a triumphant declaration. It made the arranged sections feel even more massive because of how exposed and intimate the beginning had been. When Whitney finished the full take and the last note faded into silence, nobody in the control room moved for a long moment. Then David Foster slowly removed his headphones, set them carefully on the mixing console, and turned to look at Kevin Costner with an expression that combined disbelief, respect, and something that might have been awe. "You were right," Foster said quietly. "I've been producing music for 20 years, and you were completely right. The version of I Will Always Love You, that was ultimately released to radio stations in November 1992, started with exactly what Kevin Costner had insisted upon. 35 seconds of Whitney Houston's voice completely alone, raw and vulnerable, before any instrumentation entered. The decision broke every rule of contemporary radio formatting. Program directors at pop and adult contemporary stations were genuinely confused when they first heard it. Several major market stations initially rejected the song, telling the label that it didn't fit their format and that they needed a version with a proper introduction. But something extraordinary happened when stations did play it. Listeners stopped what they were doing. Phone lines lit up with people calling to ask what song that was, who was singing it, and when it would play again. Music video television networks like MTV and VH1 reported that viewer engagement metrics spiked dramatically during the video's airtime, with people actually staying tuned instead of channel surfing during video blocks. Within 3 weeks of its release, I Will Always Love You had climbed to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, where it remained for an unprecedented 14 consecutive weeks. It went on to sell over 20 million copies worldwide, becoming the best-selling single by a female artist in music history. The song earned Whitney Houston 3 Grammy Awards and became so culturally dominant that it was essentially inescapable throughout 1993 and 1994. The commercial success was staggering, but the more profound impact was what the song represented in terms of artistic bravery. Kevin Costner's insistence on that a cappella opening forced Whitney Houston to be completely vulnerable in a way that her previous hits, as magnificent as they were, had not required. Those opening seconds, where listeners heard nothing but her voice grappling with the emotional weight of the lyrics, created a connection that transcended typical pop song dynamics. It felt personal, intimate, like she was singing directly to each individual listener rather than performing for millions. Music critics, even those who had been skeptical of Whitney's move into acting, were nearly unanimous in their praise for her vocal performance. The New York Times wrote that the a cappella opening was a masterclass in vocal control and emotional authenticity, proving that true artistry requires the courage to stand completely exposed. Whitney herself later said that recording that version of the song was one of the most terrifying and ultimately liberating experiences of her career. In interviews years later, She would talk about how Kevin Costner had somehow understood something about her voice that even she hadn't fully recognized, that its real power came not from technical perfection or impressive vocal runs, but from emotional honesty and vulnerability. "Kevin made me brave," Whitney said in a 1999 interview with Barbara Walters. "He saw something in me that I was afraid to show people. And when I finally let myself be that vulnerable, that exposed, it changed everything. Not just with that song, but with how I approached music and performance from that point forward." The relationship between Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston deepened significantly during and after the Bodyguard production. What began as a professional collaboration between a film star and a music icon evolved into a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and understanding. Kevin had seen Whitney at her most insecure and fearful, and he had responded not with impatience or frustration, but with unwavering belief in her abilities. That kind of support, especially in the high-pressure environment of a major Hollywood production, created a bond that lasted for the rest of Whitney's life. Years later, when Whitney's personal struggles became public and her career faced challenges, Kevin remained one of her most loyal defenders. He never spoke publicly about her difficulties in a sensational way, never contributed to the tabloid narrative that dominated coverage of her later years. Instead, he consistently reminded people of her artistry, her intelligence, and her incredible gift. When Whitney died in February 2012, Kevin Costner was asked to speak at her funeral. His eulogy was remarkable for its honesty and its celebration of who Whitney really was beyond the public persona. Kevin spoke about that day in the recording studio, about his certainty that Whitney's voice needed nothing behind it, and about how she had trusted him enough to be brave. "You weren't just good enough," Kevin said, speaking directly to Whitney even in death. "You were great, and when you finally let yourself believe that, when you stood in that recording booth and sang with nothing to hide behind, you showed the world what I already knew, that your voice was a gift from God, and that gift was most powerful when it was most honest." The legacy of that a cappella decision extends far beyond the commercial success of a single song. It changed how producers and artists thought about vulnerability in pop music. In the years following the release of "I Will Always Love You," there was a noticeable shift in how big vocal performances were approached in the studio. Artists became more willing to strip away production elements and let their voices carry the emotional weight, trusting that listeners would respond to authenticity even more than they responded to perfectly crafted arrangements. Today, when music students and aspiring singers study Whitney Houston's catalog, that a cappella opening of "I Will Always Love You" is taught as a defining moment in vocal performance. It represents the intersection of technical mastery and emotional courage, the willingness to be completely present and unguarded in a way that invites listeners into a genuine human experience rather than keeping them at the distance of entertained audience members. Kevin Costner made hundreds of decisions during his career as an actor, producer, and director. But the decision to insist that Whitney Houston sing those opening lines alone, with nothing to hide behind and everything to lose, might have been his most impactful. Not because it resulted in commercial success, though it certainly did, but because it showed what happens when someone sees greatness in another person and refuses to accept anything less than their full, vulnerable, magnificent truth.